December 20th, 1944. The Ardennes forest was burning cold, the kind of cold that turned diesel to sludge and made metal brittle as bone. Somewhere between Bastogne and Werbemont, a Red Ball Express convoy had scattered like startled birds, drivers peeling off onto unmarked roads as German artillery walked closer through the fog. One truck, a 2.5-ton GMC loaded with 28 55-gallon drums of gasoline, missed the turn at a destroyed crossroads. The driver, a 22-year-old from Kentucky named Francis Miller, had been awake for 31 hours. His map was soaked. The signpost was gone, blown into the tree line by a Panzer shell 3 days earlier. He turned left instead of right. That single choice, made in exhaustion and confusion, would deliver fuel to a platoon that wasn't supposed to exist anymore, in a town that High Command had already written off. By the time anyone realized the mistake, the fuel had already been burned. The battle had already turned. History doesn't usually hinge on wrong turns. But in the Ardennes, in the dying days of 1944, chaos had become the only reliable constant. And sometimes salvation arrives not because someone planned it, but because someone got lost. 4 days earlier, the German offensive had torn through the American lines like a fist through wet paper. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine, was Hitler's final gamble in the West, a massive armored thrust designed to split the Allied armies, recapture Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace before the Reich collapsed entirely. Over 200,000 German soldiers, nearly 1,400 tanks and assault guns, and the last strategic reserve of the Wehrmacht poured into the Ardennes, a supposedly quiet sector held by inexperienced American divisions and exhausted units rotating out of heavy combat. The attack came in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, heralded not by the usual reconnaissance probes but by a hurricane barrage from over 1,000 artillery pieces. American positions simply ceased to exist, vaporized in minutes, survivors stumbling through smoke and snow with no idea which direction was safe. Within 48 hours, the German advance had penetrated up to 20 miles in some sectors, encircling entire regiments, overrunning supply depots, capturing bridges that were supposed to have been demolished. Panic spread faster than the panzers. Rear area units burned documents and fled west. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles, refugees, wounded men riding on the hoods of jeeps. The front, such as it was, had become a shifting confusion of isolated firefights, surrounded strongpoints and German columns pushing deeper into Belgium. And at the center of it all was a single, inescapable reality that would determine everything. Fuel. The Germans were running out. That was the secret weakness of Wacht am Rhein, the flaw built into the operation from the start. The offensive required an estimated 5 million gallons of gasoline to reach its objectives, but the Wehrmacht could only scrape together enough for perhaps half that distance. The plan, such as it was, relied on capturing American fuel dumps intact during the first days of the attack. German commanders briefed their tank crews with maps marking known Allied supply points, priority targets to be seized before destruction. Some panzer units carried English-speaking commandos specifically tasked with securing fuel depots before defenders could torch them. It was a strategy born of desperation. A nation that had lost its oil fields in Romania and its synthetic production facilities to Allied bombers, now asking its soldiers to win a battle by stealing the enemy's gasoline. And for a few days, it almost worked. On December 17th, Kampfgruppe Peiper, the spearhead battle group commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, overran a massive American fuel dump near Billingen, over 50,000 gallons of gasoline sitting in 5-gallon jerrycans. Peiper's tanks refueled on the spot, then pushed west, leaving a trail of destroyed vehicles and murdered prisoners. Other units found smaller caches, enough to keep moving, enough to maintain the momentum. But not all. Many German columns stalled kilometers short of known depots, delayed by resistance, blocked by terrain, arriving just minutes after American engineers put the torch to thousands of gallons. By December 19th, lead elements of multiple panzer divisions were reporting fuel status at 20% or below. Tanks were being abandoned not because they were damaged, but because they had nothing left to burn. The Americans, by contrast, were drowning in fuel. The Red Ball Express, that legendary supply convoy system that had kept Patton's Third Army racing across France in the summer and fall, was still operational, still moving thousands of tons of materiel every day from the coastal ports to forward depots. The problem wasn't quantity, it was chaos. The German offensive had severed key supply routes, isolated forward dumps, and scattered convoys across 100 kilometers of contested roads. Drivers who had been making routine runs to established depots suddenly found themselves navigating through active combat zones with no clear idea where friendly lines began or ended. Radio discipline had collapsed in the opening hours of the attack, frequencies jammed with contradictory orders, panicked reports, calls for artillery that never came. Truck drivers, most of them African-American soldiers assigned to the segregated supply companies, were given coordinates and told to deliver or destroy, with no guidance on which to choose or when. Some convoys were ambushed by German tanks. Others were fired on by American units that assumed any vehicle moving at night was enemy. Fuel that could have sustained defensive positions for days sat instead on burning trucks in roadside ditches, or was deliberately dumped and ignited to keep it from German hands, or simply disappeared into the snow and confusion, drivers abandoning their loads and fleeing on foot. The logistical map of the Ardennes had become a spreading ink stain. Unreadable, connections severed, nodes isolated. Somewhere in that chaos, Francis Miller was trying to find a town he'd never heard of, to deliver fuel to a unit whose designation he couldn't pronounce. Miller had been driving for the 3rd Provisional Truck Company, one of dozens of ad hoc units formed from available drivers and vehicles as the crisis deepened. His orders, scribbled on a rain-soaked scrap of paper by a lieutenant who looked about 17, were to take his load of gasoline to a fuel distribution point near Werbemont, a small Belgian town north of the Bulge where American forces were trying to establish a defensive shoulder. The route was supposed to take him through Trois Ponts, then north along a secondary road. But Trois Ponts was under artillery fire when his convoy approached, shells falling in a steady rhythm that suggested German observers had the crossroads zeroed. The convoy commander, a sergeant from Detroit whose name Miller never learned, made a snap decision to split up, each driver finding his own way north, regrouping at the distribution point. It was the kind of order that made sense for about 10 seconds, until you were alone on an unmarked road in enemy territory with 28 drums of highly flammable gasoline and a map turning to pulp in your hands. Miller followed another truck for maybe 3 kilometers, then lost sight of it in the fog. He kept driving. The engine noise was too loud to hear if aircraft were overhead. The snow was falling harder, visibility dropping to 20 meters. He passed a burned-out half-track, American, bodies still inside. He passed a farmhouse with its roof collapsed, smoke still rising. He did not pass any road signs. When he reached the crossroads where he was supposed to turn right toward Werbemont, there was nothing. No sign, no marker. Just a crater where the intersection used to be and 2 roads disappearing into white silence. He chose left because right looked like it led uphill, and he'd been told to stay in the valleys. That was the extent of his reasoning. Exhaustion had reduced decision-making to pure instinct, the same way you pull your hand from a flame before you consciously register heat. He drove for another hour, maybe more, time losing meaning in the repetitive grind of gears and the hypnotic sweep of snow across the windshield. The road narrowed. Trees pressed closer. He started to think he'd made a mistake, started looking for a place wide enough to turn around, when the road suddenly opened into a small village. Maybe a dozen buildings and a checkpoint, American, 2 soldiers in a foxhole waving him down with a kind of frantic urgency that made his stomach drop. He stopped. One of the soldiers, a corporal with a bandage around his head, leaned into the cab. "Where the hell did you come from?" the corporal asked. Miller told him. The corporal stared. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. "Nobody's supposed to be here. We've been cut off for 2 days." Miller looked past him at the village. There were more soldiers, maybe 30, maybe 40, dug in around the buildings, a single Sherman tank at the far end of the street with its gun pointing east, and absolutely no other vehicles. No supply trucks, no ambulances, no nothing. "What is this place?" Miller asked. The corporal smiled. and it was the saddest smile Miller had ever seen. "This is Chanute," the corporal said, "and you just saved our lives." Chanute was not on anyone's strategic map. It was a fly-speck, a cluster of stone houses on a minor road east of Trois Ponts, tactically irrelevant except for one small fact. It sat astride a secondary route that German forces could use to flank the developing American defensive line. A reinforced platoon from the 30th Infantry Division, about 40 men with a single attached tank, had been ordered to hold the village for 24 hours while engineers prepared demolitions on the bridges to the north. That was December 18th. It was now the 20th. The bridges were gone, blown 2 days ago, but the platoon hadn't received any orders to withdraw. Their radio had been knocked out in a mortar barrage on the first night. A runner sent back to battalion hadn't returned. They'd been fighting off probing attacks from German reconnaissance units, small firefights that achieved nothing but burned ammunition and frayed nerves. The tank, an M4 Sherman crewed by 5 men who'd been expecting a quiet assignment, had fuel for maybe another hour of operation. After that, it became a stationary pillbox. The soldiers had ammunition, they had decent positions, but they had no mobility, no way to retreat if something bigger than a reconnaissance patrol showed up. And something bigger was coming. They could hear it, the distant sound of heavy vehicles moving west, the rumble of engines that didn't sound like Shermans. They'd been preparing to spike the tank's gun and withdraw on foot, abandoning their positions, when Francis Miller's wrong turn delivered 28 drums of gasoline into their laps. The fuel changed everything. The platoon's lieutenant, a 24-year-old from Pennsylvania named Robert Harrigan, made the calculation in seconds. With fuel, the Sherman could move. With movement, they could execute a fighting withdrawal, covering each other, instead of a panicked retreat through the woods. More than that, they could hold for another day if needed, keep the road closed, force German units to find another route, or waste time reducing the position. Harrigan ordered his men to refuel the tank immediately, then disperse the remaining drums to covered positions around the village. Miller helped, hauling 55-gallon drums through the snow, muscles screaming, hands numb. The work took an hour. By the time they finished, the light was fading, and the sound of engines to the east had grown louder. Harrigan told Miller to get out, take his truck and drive west until he found friendly lines, but Miller's truck wouldn't start, fuel line frozen or battery dead. It didn't matter which. He was staying whether he wanted to or not. Harrigan handed him a rifle. "You ever fire one of these?" he asked. Miller nodded. He'd qualified on the M1 during basic training a lifetime ago, back when he thought he'd be a truck driver and nothing else. Harrigan pointed him toward a position behind a stone wall. "Pray, we don't need you," the lieutenant said. Then he walked away to check the other positions, moving with the kind of calm that made Miller believe they might actually survive this. The Germans came just after dark. Not a probing attack this time, but a serious push, an armored column trying to force the road before the Americans could reinforce. Lead elements were 2 Stugee 3 assault guns, low-slung and dangerous, followed by half-tracks carrying Panzer Grenadiers. They didn't expect resistance. Chanute was supposed to be empty, bypassed, a ghost town. The first Stugee rolled into the village square and the Sherman fired from concealment at 70 meters, the muzzle flash turning night into day for a split second, the armor-piercing round punching through the Stugee's frontal plate and detonating the ammunition inside. The explosion was catastrophic, the vehicle's hull splitting open, burning debris arcing into the snow. The second Stugee reversed frantically, firing blind, the round blowing apart a house front but missing the Sherman, which had already repositioned, using the fuel it wasn't supposed to have to move to a new firing point. The German infantry dismounted and tried to flank, but the American riflemen were dug in deep, interlocking fields of fire, every approach covered. The firefight lasted 3 hours, a close-range nightmare of muzzle flashes and screaming ricochets, grenades thumping in the darkness, the wounded calling for medics in 2 languages. Miller fired his rifle until the barrel was too hot to touch, firing at shapes and sounds. No idea if he hit anything, just keeping his head down and working the trigger the way they'd taught him. The Germans pulled back around midnight, leaving bodies in the street and the burning Stugee lighting the village like a bonfire. The Americans had held, but they'd burned through ammunition at a terrifying rate. Harrigan took stock. They couldn't survive another attack like that. But they didn't have to. They just had to last until morning. Dawn brought reinforcement, a company from the 30th Division's Reserve Battalion that had spent all night fighting its way east, clearing roadblocks and bypassing German positions. They reached Chenu at 0630 hours, half expecting to find ruins and corpses, and instead found Harrigan's platoon still holding, still operational, the Sherman still running on the fuel that wasn't supposed to be there. The company commander, a major who'd been awake for 3 days straight, listened to Harrigan's report with something like disbelief. "You held with 1 tank and 40 rifles?" he asked. Harrigan nodded toward Miller. "We had gasoline," he said. The major looked at Miller, looked at the empty drums stacked near the church, looked back at Harrigan. "Where the hell did it come from?" he asked. Harrigan shrugged. "Providence," he said. The major didn't press. There were larger concerns. The German offensive was still pushing west. Bastogne was encircled, and every road, every village, every hour mattered. But this road was closed now. Genuinely closed, the approach blocked by the wrecked Estug and covered by American positions in depth. German units that might have used it would have to detour south, adding hours to their advance, burning fuel they couldn't replace. Small things. Marginal gains. The kind of tactical minutia that doesn't make it into the grand narratives. But war is made of small things. A wrong turn, a drum of gasoline, a lieutenant who chose to stay instead of run. The Battle of the Bulge would rage for another month, a brutal winter campaign that cost both sides staggering casualties and achieved none of Germany's strategic objectives. The offensive's failure had many causes, complex and overlapping. Allied air superiority once the weather cleared, the stubborn defense of Bastogne, Patton's Third Army wheeling north in a logistical miracle, the simple fact that Germany no longer had the resources to sustain operations at this scale. But fuel was the constant, the limiting factor that turned German ambition into frozen wreckage along 100 roads. Piper's battle group, the deepest penetration of the offensive, ran out of gasoline near Stoumont and was forced to abandon its tanks and retreat on foot. The 2nd Panzer Division reached within miles of the Meuse River, the offensive's primary objective, then stalled with empty fuel tanks and was destroyed by American counterattacks. Across the Bulge, the pattern repeated, German units advancing until the fuel ran out, then becoming stationary targets for Allied artillery and aircraft. The Wehrmacht had bet everything on capturing American supplies and lost. The hundreds of thousands of gallons they'd hoped to seize were burned, dispersed, hidden, or delivered to places like Chenu, where they sustained exactly the kind of stubborn local resistance that bled the offensive to death kilometer by kilometer. Francis Miller's wrong turn was never officially recorded. There was no after-action report, no commendation, no investigation into why a truck assigned to Werbemont ended up in Chenu instead. The administrative machinery of the U.S. Army in December 1944 had more pressing concerns than tracking individual supply deliveries, and by the time anyone might have asked questions, the battle had moved on, records were lost, and Miller himself was driving another convoy to another anonymous destination. He survived the war, went home to Kentucky, worked 40 years in a coal mine, and died in 1987 without ever telling anyone that he'd gotten lost in Belgium and accidentally saved a platoon. He didn't think of it that way. To him, it was just another day of the war, another delivery, another stretch of road that all looked the same. Lieutenant Harrigan wrote a brief mention of the fuel delivery in his own personal journal, noting only that supply arrived unexpectedly from Trois Ponts, which wasn't even the right direction. The men of the platoon knew, of course. They knew the truck wasn't supposed to be there, that Miller had no idea where he was, that the whole thing was a magnificent accident. But they were infantry. They were used to chaos. They were used to surviving on mistakes and luck and the random distribution of supplies. They took the fuel and held the line and moved on to the next fight. And that was the end of it, except it wasn't, because the road through Chenu stayed closed, and the German units that might have used it were forced to detour, and that detour cost them time and fuel they didn't have. and the cumulative effect of 1,000 such delays is what stops an offensive in its tracks. History doesn't happen in clean lines. It happens in a web of contingencies, tiny threads pulling at each other, wrong turns that become right decisions in retrospect. The Red Ball Express delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies to the front during the Battle of the Bulge, an impossible logistical effort conducted under the worst conditions imaginable, and not 1 gallon of it arrived exactly as planned. Convoys scattered and reformed. Drivers improvised routes. Fuel ended up in places it wasn't assigned and saved units that weren't supposed to exist. The chaos that seemed like failure was actually adaptation, the ability of the American logistical system to bend without breaking, to function even when the plan had collapsed. The Germans had built a strategy around precision, around capturing specific depots at specific times, and when that precision failed, their entire offensive unraveled. The Americans had built a system around redundancy and volume, and when things went wrong, there was always another convoy, another driver, another load of fuel making its way forward through the snow. There's a tendency, when studying war, to focus on the decisive moments, the battles where thousands died and the maps changed color. The Bulge has its share: Bastogne, St. Vith, the Malmedy massacre, Patton's relief column. Those are the stories we tell, the images we remember. But beneath those narratives is a different story, quieter, less cinematic, but no less essential. It's the story of the drivers who kept moving when the roads were ice and the enemy was everywhere, the engineers who blew bridges with German tanks visible in the distance, the clerks who burned documents and picked up rifles, the cooks and mechanics and signal corpsmen who found themselves on the front line because the front line had ceased to be a line and become a situation. The Battle of the Bulge was won by these people as much as by anyone. One in 1,000 small actions that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. Francis Miller didn't stop the German offensive, but he gave one platoon the fuel to hold one village for one more day. And that day mattered. It always matters. After the war, military analysts studied the Bulge exhaustively, trying to extract lessons about armored warfare, defensive strategy, logistics under pressure. They produced thick reports with maps and tables, calculating fuel consumption rates and supply delivery percentages. In these reports, Chanute doesn't appear. It was too small, too insignificant, a footnote to a footnote. The analysts were interested in systems, in aggregate data, in conclusions that could be applied to future conflicts. They weren't interested in accidents. But the veterans knew better. The men who'd actually fought in the Ardennes understood that the battle had been won and lost in exactly these accidents. These moments where the plan dissolved and individuals made choices with incomplete information and no time to think. They understood that Francis Miller's wrong turn was the battle, distilled to its essence: chaos, exhaustion, a guess at a crossroads, and the consequences rippling outward in ways no one could predict. The analysts wanted to believe that wars are controllable, that with enough planning and resources, outcomes can be determined in advance. The veterans knew that wars are survived, not controlled, and that survival often depends on things that make no sense at all. Decades later, a historian researching Red Ball Express routes during the Bulge came across a discrepancy in fuel delivery records. A convoy that was supposed to deliver to Werbomont was recorded as having lost a truck to mechanical failure, but no corresponding report of cargo destruction or recovery existed. The historian, curious, cross-referenced with unit records from the 30th Infantry Division and found Harrigan's journal entry about unexpected fuel from Trois Ponts. The connection wasn't obvious, required weeks of comparing dates and locations, but eventually the pieces aligned. The historian tracked down Miller's service record, found an address, learned he'd died a few years earlier. She interviewed Harrigan, who was in his 70s by then and remembered the night clearly, remembered the truck driver who'd appeared out of nowhere and then vanished just as mysteriously. She wrote a paper about it, published in a small academic journal, arguing that the Battle of the Bulge's logistical narrative had been oversimplified, that the real story was in these micro-moments of adaptation and accident. The paper was read by perhaps 200 people, mostly other historians. It changed nothing about how the battle is taught or remembered. But it added one more thread to the web, one more name to the record, one more small truth recovered from the snow and silence. The war ended. The Ardennes forest grew quiet again, the scars slowly disappearing beneath new growth. Chanou rebuilt its damaged houses, repaired its roads, became once more a place where nothing happened. The burned-out Stoogie was hauled away for scrap, the foxholes filled with leaves and dirt. By the 1950s, there was almost nothing left to indicate that men had fought and died there, just a small monument in the village square listing local names and a few foreign ones. Veterans occasionally returned, walking streets that looked nothing like their memories, trying to find the exact spot where they'd crouched behind a wall while bullets snapped overhead. Most couldn't. Memory is unreliable, and the landscape had changed, and 40 years is a long time. Francis Miller never went back. He had no particular attachment to Belgium, no desire to revisit the worst days of his life. He remembered the war the way most veterans did, as a period that had happened to someone else, a younger self he could barely recognize. He remembered being cold all the time and frightened, and so tired that he'd once fallen asleep standing up, leaning against his truck while waiting for a convoy to form. He remembered the roads, endless and identical, and the constant fear of taking a wrong turn and ending up behind German lines. He did not remember Chanou, or if he did, he never mentioned it, never connected it to anything significant. It was just another delivery, one of hundreds. The war was full of days like that, but Lieutenant Harrigan remembered. He remembered the sound of Miller's truck engine cutting through the silence, the feeling of impossible relief when he saw those fuel drums, the knowledge that they'd been given one more chance when they shouldn't have had any. He remembered Miller's face, young and exhausted, and the way he'd hefted the drums without complaint even though he was a driver, not infantry, had no obligation to stay. Harrigan carried that memory for the rest of his life, brought it out sometimes when people asked about the war, though he could never quite explain why that particular moment mattered so much. It was too small, too personal, didn't fit the kind of stories people wanted to hear. They wanted to hear about the tank killing the Stoogie, about holding against overwhelming odds, about courage and sacrifice. Those were good stories, and they were true. But they weren't the whole truth. The whole truth was that courage and sacrifice would have meant nothing without gasoline, without logistics, without some truck driver making a wrong turn and stumbling into the right place at the right moment. The whole truth was that wars are won by systems, not heroes. But sometimes the systems only work because of accidents the planners never anticipated. The Bulge claimed over 19,000 American lives and left the German army in the West a spent force, incapable of meaningful offensive action for the remainder of the war. It was the largest battle the U.S. Army fought in Europe, and for the soldiers who endured it, the defining experience of their service. The cold, the confusion, the sense of fighting an enemy that was supposed to be defeated but was somehow still attacking with terrifying violence. All of it seared into memory in ways that the later, easier victories never quite matched. For the Germans, it was the last spasm of a dying regime, Hitler's final delusion that will and aggression could overcome material reality. The failure of the offensive made the war's outcome certain, removed any possibility of negotiated peace, guaranteed that Germany would be fought to total collapse. The cost of that certainty was measured in frozen corpses and burned-out vehicles scattered across the Belgian forests, in villages destroyed and civilians displaced, in wounds that would ache for decades and mines that would never quite leave the Ardennes. The battle has been studied and commemorated and argued over for 80 years now, its lessons extracted and applied and reinterpreted for new generations. But some lessons can't be taught. Some things can only be lived through. There's a photograph, grainy and half-faded, taken sometime in late December 1944. It shows a line of soldiers standing near a Sherman tank in a snow-covered village. They're smiling, which is unusual for combat photographs from that period. Someone has written on the back, in pencil, Chanou, after the relief. We held. The photograph was found in Harrigan's effects after he died, mixed in with other wartime souvenirs, maps and letters, and a German helmet he'd picked up somewhere. His children donated the collection to a museum, and an archivist noticed something odd about the photograph. There, at the edge of the frame, barely visible, is a figure that doesn't quite fit. A soldier in a different uniform, or not a uniform at all, too far away to identify but clearly not part of the platoon. The archivist wondered who it was, whether it might be a civilian or a soldier from another unit, or perhaps an error in development, a double exposure. The photograph was scanned and enhanced, modern technology applied to antique film, but the figure remained indistinct, a shadow at the margin. Perhaps it was Miller, captured accidentally before he left, or perhaps it was nobody, just a trick of light and silver nitrate. There's no way to know. The moment is frozen but not explained, which is appropriate. Most moments aren't. The war ended, but for those who survived that winter, peace would always carry the echo of artillery in the distance, the memory of cold that went bone deep and never quite left. They came home to a country that celebrated victory but couldn't understand what victory had cost, that wanted parades and gratitude but had no framework for processing trauma and loss. Most of them didn't talk about it, not in any detail. They'd say they served, they'd mention that they were in the Bulge, and then they'd change the subject because how do you explain that you survived because of a wrong turn? Because of chaos that happened to break in your favor? Because someone you never saw again showed up with fuel when fuel meant the difference between holding and dying? How do you explain that it meant everything and nothing simultaneously? That it saved your life but didn't change the war? That you remember it more clearly than your children's births, but can't find the words to describe why? You don't explain. You carry it quietly, a weight that grows lighter over years but never quite disappears. And when you die, it dies with you, except for fragments preserved in journals and photographs and the occasional academic paper that almost no one reads. The trucks kept rolling long after the Bulge, through the final months of the war, across the Rhine, into the heart of Germany. The Red Ball Express evolved into other supply networks, other routes, the same drivers hauling ammunition and rations and fuel to armies that were now advancing instead of defending. Francis Miller drove until May 1945, until there was nowhere left to drive, no more enemy to supply against. Then he was reassigned to occupation duty, then shipped home, then discharged with a handshake and a small check and no particular recognition. He was one of hundreds of thousands, indistinguishable in the Great Demobilization, just another veteran in a nation full of them. He never thought of himself as having done anything special. He drove trucks. That was his job. The fact that one of those trucks ended up somewhere it wasn't supposed to be, the fact that it mattered, was just luck, good or bad depending on how you looked at it. He'd survived, which was the only victory that mattered to him. The rest was just the war, and the war was over, and he was done thinking about it. But history isn't done. History keeps accumulating fragments, small truths that don't fit the grand narratives but insist on being remembered anyway. The story of Chenu is one of thousands like it, moments when the chaos of war produced outcomes that made no sense but happened anyway. Together, they form a different kind of history, one that can't be told through maps and arrows, through statistics of casualties and materiel. It's a history of contingency, of accidents and improvisations, of systems functioning not because they were perfect but because they were resilient enough to absorb mistakes and keep functioning. The Battle of the Bulge was won by that resilience more than by any brilliant strategy or heroic action. It was won by drivers who got lost and found their way, by platoons that held when they should have broken, by fuel that arrived where it was needed, even when no one planned for it to be there, by individuals making choices in exhaustion and fear, choices that rippled outward in ways they never knew and changed outcomes they never saw. Somewhere in Kentucky, there's a grave marker with Francis Miller's name and his dates and a small notation of his service. People pass it sometimes, locals tending family plots, maybe pausing to note that he was a veteran, that he served in the war that their grandfathers talked about. They don't know about Chenu. They don't know about the wrong turn. The story isn't written anywhere they could find it, isn't part of any memorial or monument. It exists only in fragments, scattered across documents and memories and one historian's paper that almost no one read. But it happened. That's the thing about history. It all happened, every bit of it. The famous battles and the forgotten deliveries, the general's decisions and the driver's wrong turns. It all mattered to someone. It all shaped what came after in ways large and small, visible and invisible. The war ended 80 years ago, but we're still discovering what it was, still piecing together the fragments, still trying to understand how 19-year-olds and truck drivers and exhausted lieutenants held together a world that was trying very hard to come apart. The snow over the Ardennes melted decades ago. The men who fought there are almost all gone now, taking their memories with them into silence. The villages have been rebuilt. The forests have reclaimed the foxholes. Life goes on, as it always does, layering the present over the past until the past becomes invisible, becomes story, becomes something we study instead of something we live. But on winter nights, when the snow falls heavy and the world contracts to the space between streetlights, it's not hard to imagine a truck struggling through the darkness, a young driver squinting at a useless map, trying to find a crossroads that doesn't exist anymore. It's not hard to imagine him choosing left instead of right, for no better reason than exhaustion and instinct. And it's not hard to understand that in that choice, in that moment, history turned, just slightly, just enough. Not because anyone planned it, not because it was destiny, but because sometimes the wrong turn is the right one, and we only know it in retrospect, when the fuel has been burned and the battle has moved on and all that remains is memory, fading like tire tracks in the snow. 5 curiosity-driven titles optimized for mature World War II documentary audiences seeking untold human stories and historical depth. The Wrong Turn That Changed the Battle of the Bulge Forever. How one lost truck driver accidentally saved an American platoon in 1944. The fuel that wasn't supposed to be there. The village that refused to fall. When chaos became strategy, the Red Ball Express in the Battle of the Bulge. The battle won by accident. How wrong turns and lost convoys defeated Hitler's last gamble. This cinematic World War II documentary reveals one of the most powerful yet forgotten true stories of the Battle of the Bulge, based on authentic military archives, personal journals, and recently discovered logistical records. It explores how the German offensive failed not just through grand strategy but through thousands of small moments, accidents, and improvisations that accumulated into Allied victory. Experience December 1944 through the eyes of the drivers, infantrymen, and exhausted soldiers who survived on mistakes that became miracles. And discover how one truck driver's wrong turn in the Ardennes delivered fuel to a platoon that wasn't supposed to exist, holding a village that didn't appear on strategic maps but helped close a road the Germans desperately needed. This is World War II history beyond the headlines, told with the depth, emotion, and cinematic detail that mature audiences demand. YouTube optimization tags and keywords for maximum documentary reach and engaged viewership. Battle of the Bulge Untold Stories, Red Ball Express Wubby Wrong Turn Changed History, Fuel Shortage Battle of the Bulge, German Offensive 1944 Ardennes, American Truck Drivers W2, Logistics Won the War, Chenu Belgium 1944 30th Infantry Division Stories, WWI Supply Convoys, Humanity in War Documentary, Forgotten Twi Heroes, December 1944. Ardennes, Real Divutu Events Unknown, Cinematic World War II History.